We can think of the geological history of Earth as kind of a clock. The origin of Earth in the solar system would be here, and then time is going to progress clockwise around this clock. And you can see that there are four main eras: 1, 2, 3, and 4, from about 4.6 billion years ago when we think the Earth was formed. So in the first three eras, we're not seeing much in the way of life as we imagine it on Earth. It's not until the fourth era, which is only about 0.5 billion years ago, which might sound like a long time, but in the history of everything, it's relatively short, that we start to see land animals, plants, organisms that would even represent or even look similar to what we see today. And you can see humans is that teeny tiny little red dot right there at the very end of the geological time cycle of Earth as we know it. So we're going to go through some of these kind of key events that have happened, and they're key events because they're massive stepping stones that kind of moved the progression of life forward. So the very first evidence of life on Earth at all were the stromatolites, and these are single-celled prokaryotes that largely accumulated in what would be considered like mats. So these the prokaryotes would have all accumulated on like large rocks, and then they formed fossils on these rocks, and then that's what is left over. And it's very possible that there was life on Earth before this, so this is happening about here. 3.5 billion years ago. And it's possible there was life back here, but we don't know because it didn't leave a fossil. And the prokaryotes were alone for a long time, for about 1.5, so that takes you all the way to about here, billion years. The prokaryotes were alone. They were the only organisms on Earth were these single-celled bacterial cells. Ancient Earth had an atmosphere that was very different. It had a lot of carbon dioxide in early Earth with very little oxygen. So this is a logarithmic scale. You can see how each jump here increases by times 10. So from about 2.5 billion years ago, there was this massive jump, right? So this is about right here. There was this massive jump called the oxygen revolution. And what we think happened here is that this was likely where organisms started being able to develop the ability to do photosynthesis. So we don't have chloroplasts yet. These are still bacteria, right? Prokaryotic bacteria that are now able to do photosynthesis. It's likely that their cell membranes kind of folded in on themselves to provide some membranes for the process of photosynthesis, or the precursors of photosynthesis, to go ahead and start producing oxygen as a byproduct. And this was massively successful, and you can see natural selection picked this method of obtaining energy from the sun as optimal at this point. And so the oxygen was a byproduct. And what happened is now we've changed the atmosphere from one that was mostly CO2 to one that has these large percentage of aerobic oxygen. And it'll go up again later when we see kind of land plants emerge as well. The first eukaryotic cells. So up until this point, all of the cells were prokaryotes. And we see eukaryotes arising by this process of endosymbiosis. So endo means inside, sym means together, and then bio is life. So endosymbiosis. So here's a story of an ancestral prokaryote. It's got some infoldings of its cell membrane. This is likely how we got that oxygen revolution. So these cell membranes are going to eventually become things like the Golgi body, the ER, the rough ER, the smooth ER. And it makes kind of a eukaryote precursor. So this is a eukaryotic cell now because it's got a nuclear membrane. Right here, it's got an endoplasmic reticulum. So it has membrane-bound organelles. So one day, this eukaryote cell encounters a little bacterial cell, and this bacterial cell is able to do aerobic respiration, right? Like cellular respiration, or the precursor to cellular respiration, maybe something like glycolysis. And this cell eats it. And instead of digesting it for food, it realizes that if it just hangs on to the cell, it's going to be able to provide it through energy, right? We're going to be able to take glucose and turn it into ATP. And that's advantageous, being the only cell with a little ATP factory inside of you. And so it creates this symbiosis between the bacterium that lives inside of this other larger cell. And over generations and thousands of millions of years, eventually this becomes a symbiotic relationship where this organelle now inside of here has lost its other capabilities and it can't survive outside of the cell. We think this endosymbiosis was serial, meaning one and then another one, and that the mitochondria developed first, and then the second endosymbiosis event resulted in plastids like chloroplasts. So here's my ancestral eukaryote. It's heterotroph, and it comes along and it engulfs a photosynthetic bacterium. And the same kind of thing happens. So instead of eating it, it decides, hey, I can use this bacterium as a mechanism of collecting sunlight and producing my own food, and then I can take my little food factory here and produce it into ATP. And so this would have been an ancestral photosynthetic eukaryote that's going to go on to be something maybe like an algae or a plant. And we think that mitochondria were engulfed first because we have organisms that have mitochondria, like fungus and animals, but don't have chloroplasts. But all of the organisms that have chloroplasts either do have mitochondria or have remnants of mitochondria left over. There's a lot of evidence for this theory of endosymbiosis. When we look at the mitochondria and the plastids, we see a lot of similarities. Their inner membranes are very similar to the plasma membranes of bacteria, hinting that they might have been bacteria at some point in their lineage. The DNA structure of these organelles is very similar to bacteria as well. They both have their own separate DNA, right? These are DNA that are outside of the nucleus that they are able to transcribe and translate on their own. And they all have their own ribosomes. And the ribosomes found inside of mitochondria and plastids are more similar to those of bacteria than they are to the other ribosomes out here inside the cell. So at this point we have eukaryotic cells, but they're still only single-celled. So we have single-celled eukaryotic organisms. And then some point about 1.2 billion years ago, we had the development of what's multicellularity. And this is super important because it's the first jump to being able to build large, complex bodies. And what's going to make something multicellular is the ability to kind of specialize cells inside of the body to do different functions. A single-celled organism, each cell has to be able to function entirely, do the entire function of a living thing. But now that I'm multicellular, I can kind of say this section of me is going to collect energy, and maybe this section of me is going to hold me up. And I can start to have increasing complexity. And with increasing complexity and variability, we now have more stuff for natural selection to play with. So the first animals are evident about 0.7 billion years ago. These animals would have all been aquatic, living in the ocean. And it wasn't until about 500 million years ago that we saw something called the Cambrian explosion. And this is a massive radiation of fossils of organisms that start to actually look similar to what we consider alive today. We do believe that some animals, like sponges and cnidarians, which are like your jellyfish and your coral, and even some early mollusks, were around for a very long time. But it wasn't until we start to see this Cambrian explosion here in the Cambrian period that animals started to radiate. And one thing that happened that was of note is we start to see distinct predators and prey body shapes. So the predators have things like teeth and claws and jaws that are now going to be very advantageous for capturing food. And then prey organisms start to show things like shells and methods of protecting themselves against prey, or methods of protecting themselves against predators. Organisms moved on land here. We think that the first organisms on land were actually fungus, followed very closely by plants. And this is likely because the fungus actually helped the roots of plants to develop. Early plants, when they first came on land, did not have roots, and so they had to form some symbiotic relationships with fungi to be able to get enough water. So think about going from in water to on land. You're going to have a whole suite of different problems to deal with. So for plants, it was great in some aspects because I can get more sunlight. If I'm outside of the water, I have more access to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But now I have to deal with things like drying out, the fact that sperm only move through the water, and I need a different method of fertilizing female parts, and gravity. I have to hold myself up now. So these are all issues that plants had to kind of make adaptations to. The first animals we believe on land were arthropods, like things like small insects that wouldn't have had an issue with drying out because they have an exoskeleton that helps keep them strengthened against gravity issues and keep them from drying out.